Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we are going to be starting a brand new mini-series entitled Analyzing African Philosophy. We're going to do a series of, I think it's going to be 8 videos in total on different philosophies out of Africa. So before covering this topic, there are several caveats. First, Africa is a huge place comprising many countries, cultures, and languages. Therefore, claims that a single philosophical tradition or culture pervade the continent are an oversimplification of reality. Even those that argue that maybe there's a uniting Bantu philosophy, or there's a uniting philosophy that fits certain sections of the African continent, even large majorities of the African continent, still admit that that's based on a shared cultural and linguistic tradition that some areas do not share. And some of these questions around whether or not there's kind of that shared cultural philosophy or not are going to be some of the questions we'll look at in this series. Second, the majority, though not all, of ancient African philosophy, going back kind of pre-colonialism, is oral. Therefore, it's much more difficult to nail down than things that we have a written tradition of, in terms of the meanings of particular terms, concepts, or positions. That doesn't necessarily mean that those positions do not exist, and in fact, when we look into ethnophilosophy, we're going to see some of the kind of philosophical methodologies that have been argued for to use to kind of codify oral traditions. Or that those positions are in any way inferior, simply that it's more difficult to get agreement on them because there's not a specific shared text that everyone that's talking about a philosophy is going back to. So, those are a couple caveats. There also is very little comparatively written about African philosophy out there compared to even East Asian philosophy, Islamic philosophy, traditional Western European philosophies. And because of that, we're going to be relying on just a few sources to kind of try to build this out and doing some of that ethnophilosophy of building in what philosophies can we infer from cultures. But we'll get to that in another video. The series will cover a range of positions drawing from both traditional African beliefs and contemporary positions. We're going to focus primarily on sub-Saharan Africa, as North African traditions bear more resemblance to Middle Eastern or European traditions, and there's actually more documentation of those. Carneades himself was a North African philosopher from North Africa and eventually immigrated to Greece and did a lot of philosophy there, but those traditions are much more intertwined with the traditional Western canon than kind of the sub-Saharan African traditions due to the boundary of the Sahara Desert for ideas and trade spreading in the area. This series is not intended at all to be exhaustive of all African philosophy that's out there, but rather it's to provide an introduction to several influential positions from different parts of the continent, and to some non-influential positions that just might be interesting to look into. All of these are going to be short introductions. They're not serving the purpose of giving you a full, in-depth understanding of African philosophy, but it should be a good primer or first step for folks who are steeped in Western traditions to get started on African philosophy. Specifically, we're going to look at positions which can be traced to Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, the Congo, Ethiopia, South Africa, and a few more, though we're going to focus on traditions from those places, which we're going to go into in a second. So first off, we're going to start off with what is ethnophilosophy, particularly looking at the works of Leopold Senghor from Senegal, and the ideas of how you can use shared norms or cultures to kind of construct an idea that might be more in conversation with analytic philosophy. Then we'll look at what is Ubuntu philosophy. This is coming more out of South Africa. Ubuntu isn't talked as much about in the kind of strict philosophical literature, but it is a philosophy or a philosophical idea that's out there. So we want to kind of dissect that and see how we can bring it in line, or at least bring it in conversation with analytic philosophy. Then we'll look at what is Yoruba Epistemology. Yoruba is a language and ethnic group primarily in Nigeria and the surrounding areas. This is going to be looking at their epistemology as we understand it. Then we'll look at what is Akan Philosophical Psychology. This is a philosophy coming out of Ghana and the relations between it and psychology and the mind and those kinds of things. Then we'll look at what is Bantu philosophy. So Bantu is a language group and a ethnic group that spread across large parts of Central and Eastern Africa. And there are some arguments around Bantu philosophy, particularly coming from Placid Temples, which argue that there's kind of this one conception of philosophy or of norms that we can apply to a wide range of cultures in that area. Then we'll look at what is Ethiopian philosophy. Ethiopian philosophy is fascinating. It's one of the few African philosophies where we do have a written tradition that dates back long before colonialism. Ethiopia was the only country in Africa never to be colonized, and so they have a special history and a special connection in a way that a lot of the places in Africa don't. So we'll, like I said, just a basic primer on it. There's a lot more we could get into on any of these topics, but particularly because of the written history in Ethiopia, there's a lot more we could dig into. So just a basic one here. And finally, what is Pan-Africanism? That specific philosophical belief and political belief in some ways, and how can it be applied to analytic philosophy? Whew. So that was the intro to our series on analyzing African philosophy. We'll go through Ethnophilosophy, Ubuntu Philosophy, Yoruba Epistemology, Akan Philosophical Psychology, Bantu Philosophy, Ethiopian Philosophy, Pan-Africanism, and that's going to be the series. So I have spent a lot of time in Africa. I'm excited to do this series, especially because there's not a lot of information out there on these philosophies. If you think there's a particularly interesting philosophy that I have missed in kind of the African philosophical scope, please leave it down in the comments. I'm very interested to hear what else is out there. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.